Hey guys, Jesse Nelson with Family Tree Nursery, and today what I want to talk about is fall gardening. Going into the fall is a really amazing time to do some vegetable gardening, and it's one of those things a lot of people, we plant stuff in the spring, we're fighting all summer long to keep it alive, looking good and producing, and sometimes just by the time we get to fall, we're just so done with jacking around with gardening. Kids are going back to school, we're finishing our summer vacations, and so sometimes we're just kind of burnt out. But the reality is, if you'll take some time and do a fall garden, you will be so amazed with how much easier it is and how amazing the flavor of your produce is. And so I'd really like to encourage you to consider what we're going to talk about today, because it's really the easiest time of year to do a garden, and the flavor overall is going to be the best. And so one tool I want to give you guys is, here at the store, we have our edibles catalog. And in this edibles catalog, there's some really great resources and tools. One, it talks about the different vegetables and herbs and some tips and tricks on how to fertilize, how to trim back and thin things out, and how to get the best harvest. But one of my favorite things is the very first page is a planting calendar. And on the planting calendar, what's really, really nice is it talks about all the different vegetables, and it talks about when you should plant them, and then based off when you're planting them, when you'll be harvesting them. And you'll see on there's certain things that are more the vegetables that you can do in the fall. You'll see you can do them in the early spring in like March, and then you can do them again in late August, early September for fall. So a lot of your cool season vegetables, you can actually get 2 crops per year. So in spring, you can, spring and fall, you can do things like lettuce, spinach, kale, pretty much any of your leafy greens. You can do your root crops, carrots, radishes, beets. You can do also like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. And the reality is you can do all those in spring. You're going to be harvesting them up until it gets really hot in the summer, and then they're done. And then you're going to come back in the middle of August to beginning of September. You're going to plant them again, and you could be harvesting them honestly all the way into the new year and beyond, depending on what the weather does in the fall. The other side of that is if you just plant them out in the yard and don't do anything to them, you're probably going to get a good harvest, and you're going to have some produce. However, if you're able to cover them with like a frost blanket, or do like a high tunnel or low tunnel over where you've planted, and protect those plants a little bit more from some of the frosts and freezes as we get later into the season, you'll be harvesting even longer. But again, there's some winters here in Kansas City that, we'll have hardly any frost or freeze all the way up until Christmas almost. And so those years you could be harvesting all the way up till Christmas and have, fresh greens and root crops and stuff to have on the table around the holidays, which is awesome. Again, these plants are going to have such better flavor as we go into the fall. The biggest thing is the ground temperature is really warm coming out of summer, but the air temperatures are cooling down. And so what that does is it causes for all these cool season vegetables to maintain a really rich and crisp flavor. Where what happens in spring is we plant them early, the ground temperatures are cool, they start out a little slower, and then as it gets hot, they start getting bitter and kind of a little almost untasteful. And so in the fall, that's why we really like to encourage people to plant your cool season vegetables in the fall, because the flavor is the best, and they start out really quick and they're really easy to get going. Now, some dynamics of this I'd like to talk about would be, if you're going to do things like a broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, things that are going to take longer to form a head, even like some of your leafy or your head lettuce, all those type of plants, if you're going to start with seed in the garden, really need to be planted around the early to middle part of August. And it seems like a really weird time of year to be planting that stuff because it's so stinking hot and dry typically. But the reality is you need to get those growing and germinated, so that once we get into September, the air temperatures start cooling, it's going to give you enough time to actually get a harvest on those. If you don't plant the seed of those until we get into September and the weather's cooling, sometimes we might get an early freeze or something that could actually kind of stunt that plant and cause it not to produce very well. So a lot of those plants, your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, things that are going to take longer to form a head, we want to start them a little earlier in the garden if we're doing it from seed. Now, we also start those in containers for you at our production farm. And so like this here is a kale, we've got a broccoli. So we started these back then in the early to middle part of August by seed. And so that we already have starter plants that you can just come in, plant that in your garden right now, and you've got a really nice head start, and you didn't have to fret and deal with all the heat and dry in the middle of August when everybody's typically, like I said, busy, you know, getting kids back to school or taking vacations, stuff like that. If you're wanting to do more of your leafy greens or root crops, so, you know, your lettuces, your spinach, kale, things like that, you can do those by seed as we get into the early part of September and we're past those really hot days. If you start those too early in August by seed in the ground, they'll actually start growing, and then they can start getting really bitter and bolting and not having as good a flavor. So a lot of your leafy greens and root crops, that's okay to wait until that early part of September to plant those and row them up, and then be harvesting, like I said, potentially all the way until Christmas almost. Spinach, kale, extremely cold tolerant. They can take quite a few frost freezes and they'll be okay. I've had kale and spinach both actually still growing in March from the year before. Lettuce, on the other hand, is a little bit more sensitive to cold. So if we're gonna do lettuce, once we start getting down to freezing temperatures, the lettuce will actually freeze and it'll turn to mush. And so lettuce is a little less cold tolerant, but if you were to plant early September, you should actually still be able to get a really nice harvest in the fall before we start getting into those freezing temperatures. So as far as your leafy greens, I'm all about the spinach and kale, simply for that fact they can take some really cold, and how nice to be able to go around Thanksgiving or Christmas and be harvesting, you know, a fresh batch of spinach to mix into your table. So a lot of your cole crops are really easy in the fall, again, because we got that warm ground temperature, the air temperature is cooling. But again, if there's ways we can protect them, if there's a way we can throw a frost blanket over it if they're calling for frost at night, or do kind of a low tunnel over them to protect them, you're going to have a harvest well into probably November, December, depending on what the weather does. Again, here in the Midwest, weather is always a toss-up. We never know what's going to happen, right? Some days or some years it's 90 degrees all the way into October, and other years by the time we're in October we're getting snow. So we love that mystery we have here, but you do have to just take some of those things into consideration as far as extending that crop. Another thing we do have here is we have a fall garden care sheet, and this is also available on our website at www.familytreenursery.com. And we actually have all of our care sheets on different categories of plants and different aspects of gardening that you can access on the website if you're needing some more information or are curious about something. So definitely reference that. The other thing I really like to talk about with fall gardening is typically we don't need to do a ton of soil preparation. A lot of times we've done our soil prep going into the spring, getting it ready for spring planting. If you want to do some light tilling and putting some fresh compost and things into that soil, you certainly can for the fall, but you can also just plant straight into the ground. Every year, you know, if you take 2 or 3 years and really amend your soil well in your garden, after that, your soil is going to be so rich and good, you really won't need to be amending it a lot. But here in the Midwest, typically we have a lot of clay and a lot of really crummy soil, to be honest. And so amending that soil for a few years to get it really rich is good. We're going into the fall. We don't need to do a lot of that necessarily. But the one thing we do need to consider is fertilizing. And so today I've brought out the Garden Tone and Tomato Tone to show you. These are both an organic slow release fertilizer. You really, if you're going by seed and you're going to direct seed right into the ground, you really don't need to fertilize right when you're seeding. But as soon as those plants emerge and start to grow and they have a little size to them, then we can go in and start fertilizing it. But nutrients are essential. You have got to feed your vegetable plants. You know, I talk to people all the time throughout the summer that are like, why aren't my plants producing as good? My neighbor's got tons of tomatoes, I only have a few. The reality is though, if you'll go in and fertilize your vegetable garden, you will always have better and more produce. And so I highly encourage you, if you're going to do a fall garden, make sure you fertilize. It's just such an important ingredient in the process of this. And so definitely consider fertilizing. The other thing I brought out today to talk about is one of my favorite tools. It's called a hori-hori knife. And the hori-hori knife I find is a great tool. And the reason is, one, it's a knife and I'm a guy. And so like anytime you got something that's sharp and dangerous, it's just exciting, right? I think so anyways. But I love this tool, and simply because You can dig holes with this, you can weed with it. I also find the fact it's got a really nice sharp point to it. When I'm seeding, I can really make a nice groove into the ground to plant my seed into. And most of the Hori Hori knives also have on them kind of a measuring gauge, so you know how deep you're planting. So you're not planting your seed too deep or too shallow. But this is a great tool to have on hand, especially for fall gardening, to be able to row up those seeds, or if you need to dig a little hole for a little pot and plant that. And it's just a fun tool to carry around, feel like you're doing something important. Anytime you got a knife, right, you're doing something valuable here. You could also, some of them are more sharp than others, but you could also use this to do, maybe cutting a few leaves off and things, but probably better to get a pair of scissors for that. But any guy, we like our knives, so that's a great tool. Again, as far as seeding, things like radishes or beets, carrots, those are all going to be great in the fall. They can take the cool temperatures. With most of the seeds being leafy greens or root crops, what I like to do is I'll actually row them up, and then as they start germinating and sprouting, a lot of times I'll go in there and I'll thin them out, because it's kind of, unless you're really tedious about it and like perfectly spacing all those little seeds, which some of those seeds are tiny, so it's really hard to do that. So what I do a lot of times, I'll let them start growing up, and then I'll go through and I'll take maybe every other or every third plant and pull it out, so it gives the other plants actually more room to thrive and produce really well. So whenever you're doing stuff from seeding, it's important to consider that you might need to go in and thin some things out a little bit as they grow. Beyond that, like I said, fall is the easiest time to grow a garden. Typically the pests are dying, the diseases are going away, it's cooling down, the ground temperature is still warm. We usually get some nice gentle rains in the fall. So it's one of those times of year where we're kind of tired, but if you can recharge yourself and take the energy and effort to plant a fall garden, I think you'll be so happy with the outcome. And like I said, we're always here to help. We have our edibles catalog, our care sheets. We want you to be successful, so we're always happy to be here to answer your questions. Feel free to add questions in the comment section below, and we'll be happy to answer those questions as we can. Another thing I'd like to mention, guys, if you're gonna hit that subscribe button below, we'd be pumped to continue to put this content out to help you be more successful in your garden. Also, if there's videos that you think would be really interesting or helpful for you in gardening, you got questions, you got information that you need, throw that in the comment section. That'll give us more ideas of what content we can put out to help you be successful, and we'd be excited to answer any questions or anything else you have.